Well, thank you for coming to our Distinguished Speaker Series. If somebody was up here reading my bio, they would tell you that I've been here, I've been in Key West for 25 years, and I have been at Art and Historical for 12 of those years, curating and writing all the art and history exhibits that we have. And we have 4 museums, if you don't know, the Museum of Art and History, the Lighthouse Museum, Tennessee Williams Museum, the Fort East Martello. Don't ask me about Robert the Doll, okay? And then lastly, we are adding a 5th museum, hopefully soon, and that will be the Historic Jail Museum over here on Whitehead Street. So we have our work cut out for us. If you're interested in any of that, let me know. I'm happy to tell you where we are with these projects. But tonight, I want to talk about the history of tourism. It's a very big topic. I promised somebody out in the lobby that I'm like, oh, I'm on point. So I want to kind of keep this to an hour because I can go on and on. There's a lot of history here in the tourism industry. So this talk is going to take us from early days of tourism in the Florida Keys and bring us up to about the 1980s. And the reason I'll stop there is because I will keep you here way past dinner. And the second reason I do that is because from the 1980s until now, there has not been a major change in tourism. The tourism market that exists today is analogous to what existed from the 1980s forward. So to me, there's not a real reason to delve into that too much. So I'll bring you about 1980, and then I'll cut you loose. All right. So the reason I wanted to focus on tourism in the Florida Keys is because it is our main industry here, but it wasn't. And we've talked about industries in other talks, but we've never really focused on tourism and how it evolved on its own, rather than talking about it as a necessity once all these other industries waned. So I wanted to think about that and how people become mobilized. I mean, tourism is dependent on people being mobile, being able to get somewhere. Whether it's the Florida Keys, whether it's Hawaii or Europe, South America, the need for transportation is there. And when the Americans are able to mobilize a little bit more late 19th century through railroads and then early 20th century through cars, that changes the dynamic about how people travel, because before it was mainly by ship, and it's difficult and arduous to travel that way. To me, thinking about all of these things have to come together for tourism to really happen. And I want to talk about the development here in the Keys. So we're going to talk about early Key West. Settled in 1822. I usually share either some slide. So because we're all sitting here, you don't know where you are. So I always put a map just in case. You have no idea where you are. There we are, shaded down the bottom there. And so we're settled in 1822. We get a Navy pretty quick, but our focus is definitely not on health or on tourism, because we have some health problems down here. If you came to the yellow fever talk a few weeks ago, I think you'll know quite well why this place could not really be a tourist destination from the outset. But they begin to start building some infrastructures, because whether it's not tourism that we see early on, what we do see are sailors being very mobile. That's the nature of their business. They're in and out of ports, and port cities want to accommodate sailors, because sailors are usually in port, especially when you're in a sailing ship versus a coal ship. You're usually in port for several days, and there needs to be entertainment. And if you want to entertain a sailor, I'm sure you can probably figure out that Key West, aside from building warehouses, a courthouse, and et cetera, that we also have saloons popping up pretty quickly to entertain our very temporary, I wouldn't call them tourists, but visitors to the island. So we think about this, but we are a port city, and everybody does that. And not too far down the street from the saloons, this is a map of Key West in 1838, not too far away from the saloons, I just want to point out, is the jail and the courthouse. Just not saying anything. I'm not pointing fingers. We certainly, I apparently needed it with all the saloons and the transient sailors in town. But we get accommodations, even though we don't have tourists. We think about, or the way this town develops is through tourism, or these temporary visitors. And the first person who thinks about how to market it, and it's out of necessity, not out of an idea like, oh gee, I can Airbnb my house in Key West in 1823. That's not it. She is this is Ellen Mallory, or the bust of Ellen Mallory that sits in the sculpture garden, if you're familiar, that's near El Maison de Pepe and Waterfront Playhouse. She moves here with her husband and her 2 children in 1823, the year after Key West is settled. And we believe she's probably the first white woman settler in Key West. Now, she moves here with the husband, 2 kids. Her husband and one of her sons contracts an illness and passes away, so she is left as a widow with a small child at home, and they died in 1825, so they're not here, a long amount of time. Ellen Mallory has to think how to survive. She is trained as a nurse. She's the island's only nurse, which I think people were grateful for, although she couldn't really help her husband, but that's okay. So she decides to take her house. This is her house here. This is, if you're familiar with Truman Annex, if you've been through the property, HTA's headquarters, Building 21, anybody, sort of that area near Truman Little White House. This is where Ellen Mallory's house was, and it was called Coconut Grove, and she would rent rooms to visitors in town, be there businessmen, sailors that wanted to not be on the ship and had a little extra pocket money and sleep landside versus on a ship. And she rented out her house to these people for extra money, and she does really well doing it because she's the only game in town, frankly, except if you found somebody that would do it privately, but not as on the regular. And Ellen Mallory's son is Stephen Mallory, who was the head of the Confederate Navy in the Civil War. So she does quite well for herself. She's able to send him to college. She's able to pay for her livelihood in town. However, we'll go through a couple of these. So she's the pioneer matron. This is how they remember her after she died. She's the pioneer matron of the place. She was presented with a choice lot of land. She took a great lot, by the way, on which she's erected a house, which she now occupies as a boarding house, dispensing to the stranger with liberal hand and at a moderate price the hospitalities of the place. Great review on Yelp for her. This one, not so much. The New York Daily Times printed an article entitled Key West Enjoyments, in which the author declared Ellen Mallory's boarding house as being inferior to a first-class pigsty. At the north, the floor is good, but it's never scrubbed. So mixed reviews here for Ellen, but she really, as I say, the only game in town. So you've got slim pickings, and Ellen's your gal. But early Key West, despite having this boarding house, there's sort of limited options, and Key West will not focus on upping their what we would consider attractions, tourist attractions in town. The people that Key West targets in its early years, so from the 1820s really up to the Civil War, are people, and this was big money back in the day, or people that had money could afford it, was health reasons. You were a health tourist. You didn't travel for pleasure. You traveled to escape the terrible winters. Pretty much what half of you, I think, in this audience are doing. Except maybe it's not health related, right? You know that the winters up north are not as nice as they are on a beautiful day like this. And doctors made huge recommendations to people, especially with pulmonary issues, and told them to go find a warm climate to spend the winter if you could. And this health tourism was a big deal. It didn't fold into Florida too much. It was a wilderness still. Most people went further south into the settled Caribbean islands or into the Bahamas. Even Bermuda had a larger health tourist industry. But most of the main reason people were coming here, even if they had health reasons, was really this was a stopover for them as they're on their way to somewhere else warmer and a little bit more established with things to do and doctors. That was really important for them. And you can find people. If it wasn't Ellen Mallory, you can find somebody to rent you a room in their house, even if you're only here for a few days, for about $7 to $10 a week, which is quite the bargain. And in a few published sources, I think the same one that called Ellen Mallory's place a first-rate pigsty, they actually talked up the number of doctors on this island, because that was the TDC marketing at the time, was to say, never mind, don't worry about the beaches, don't worry about this, don't worry about that. The thing that you will find attractive as a tourist, you want to know that Key West has some pretty reasonable doctors already in residence here, and if you want to come spend the winter, then at least you'll have decent medical care according to the journals. So these wealthy tourists start making their way to Florida. You'll find this book that was published. I can't remember exactly when it was. Where is it? Yeah, it's great, right? I'm dying to find a copy of this somewhere and read it. It's in the library. I mean, I've pawed through it, but I want to find a copy for us. But Florida for Tourists, Invalids, and Settlers. So if you're just like covering all your bases by publishing books, pamphlets, you name it, there's a lot of promotional material that was being distributed throughout the country as Florida is turning from a wilderness into a more settled area. Books and pamphlets were published that would attract people to Florida to talk about what the goodness was in Florida. And oranges, of course, with the health, everybody knew about scurvy then. It's like, oh, Florida's got a bunch of citrus, at least my scurvy's tackled. They would always tout that, and a lot of the taglines, I kind of like this from this particular volume. They called it a blessed, unviolate spot of earth, a blissful garden. It's probably the last time Florida was referred to as not being violated, but that's okay. But it was difficult to get here. You can publish all you want, but it was very, very difficult to get to Florida. And never mind the mainland, it was even more difficult to try to get yourself into the Florida Keys. That presented a whole host of problems above and beyond getting to the mainland. And so transportation, as I said from the outset, you're not going to have tourism advance without an advancement in the way that you can be transported from wherever you're coming from to Florida, any part of Florida that you were looking for. And in an odd way, one of the earliest boosts of tourism, and I'll kind of go into this, is not only train lines coming here, and really infiltrating the northern part of the state, making it more accessible. Even before Flagler, there are some small railroad lines coming out of Georgia and hugging the East Coast. The thing that really changes, or one of the things that inspires tourists to Florida, and one of their best marketing tools, comes in the form of Civil War veterans. Because a lot of the Civil War, both Union and Confederate, spent time in the Florida Peninsula, even though we don't have any major conflict in Florida. But they sent a lot of troops from both sides into the Florida Peninsula because of the blockade, trying to get goods in and out for either side's benefit. And tourists, these soldiers and sailors, would return to Florida as tourists after that, because they saw how underdeveloped Florida was. Their homes, especially if you were living in the South, chances are your livelihood was gone, and you saw an opportunity. So the big developer or early developers in Florida are going to be at least somehow tangentially kind of connected to the Civil War. But as I said, you have these railroads, you have steamship lines, and these influx of tourists start coming, but they're not going to come here specifically yet. They're going to target St. Augustine, Tampa, Apalachicola, somewhere that was a little bit easier to get to. That doesn't mean we don't have growth in our what we would classify as a tourism industry. They wouldn't, but we would now with hindsight, because we are building accommodations. Ellen Mallory was, not long going to, for much longer run her guest house. That we had to open purpose-built facilities for businessmen. Key West is growing at a rapid pace. We're earning a lot of money. We have businessmen who have interests in other port cities around the Gulf or on the East Coast, traveling to Key West for business purposes, or at least staying over, and they don't want to stay on the ship. They would really like to stay on dry land, even if it's for a couple days. And so one of the first hotels we get is, this is the Russell House. I pointed it right to you there with the arrow. And this is here before the Civil War. Right, so we have accommodations because we do have that influx of mostly businessmen, and the book that I showed you before for the tourists, the invalids, and the settlers, they write up the authors of that book spend a little bit time in Key West. They stay at the Russell House. We get a good feel of the accommodation, and in the book they go, and there's the published date. I should have just kept that to myself for a few minutes and then worked it out. But they said, and this is perfect because I can pick this up and put this in a tourist brochure today, right? Everything in and about Key West is strange, foreign, and interesting. The business houses and public house buildings, the dwellings, the gardens, the lawns, flowers, trees, soil, and vegetation, the appearance of the people, their costumes, and even their names are all so un-American and suggestive of a foreign clime that it is difficult indeed to realize it as one of the busy, enterprising cities of our United States. Nevertheless, in this far-off, isolated community of Uncle Sam's family are found the same social sentiments and the same interests as among all American citizens. Maybe I changed some of the language, but at least the first part I'd leave as is for this, because it is weird and wonderful. But this is great marketing for us because there's going to begin a shift in thinking about tourism for health reasons to tourism going, ooh, I want to go where something is strange, foreign, and interesting, versus I can't breathe in Chicago in the winter and my doctor's recommended it. So we're going to start seeing the needle move on why people are moving around the globe for pleasure versus health. And it doesn't hurt that around the same time that book is published, talking about Key West, amongst other places, mostly Tampa. They spend a lot of time on the west coast of Florida. Former U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant comes to Key West. So this is what was appeared in Harper's Weekly. There's Ulysses S. Grant in a carriage. This is the Russell Hotel here in the background that I showed you. He came. He was he had been president. Had been 11 years since his tenure in office. He came here, and it was really interesting because the Key Westers loved the fact that Grant was here. All the businesses, according to Jefferson B. Brown, who was a early historian of Key West, said all the businesses closed because they heard former President Grant was coming and they wanted to celebrate. So they put bunting up all over and they really rolled out the red carpet for him. He did not spend the night. He came and did a stop. He stopped for the day, but they hosted a luncheon. This is one of the favorite things that we have in our collection, and at every opportunity I get to throw this out to people, I will. This is a menu printed on silk that is for the reception of they call him General Grant, which I find interesting, at the Russell House in Key West, January 21st, 1880. And it outlines everything that was on the menu that day that included turtles, pineapples, coffee, bananas, fruitcake, and all sorts of the weird and wonderful foreign things that people were going to celebrate later on. And of course, this goes out to the newspapers. They have hotels, they have this, because it all gets written up, and we can't get ourselves away from what are these notable people doing, and then I want to be there. So it does have a knock-on effect. Also, about the same time, Winslow Homer spends time here in Key West and in the Bahamas, and he creates this series of watercolors, of which I will show you two. This is one that he completes during one of his visits. He's here several times, but this gets marketed. Like, you can take his work and replicate it and share the tranquility of the Florida Keys. And this is in the winter. I mean, he's here in the winter like a snowbird, and it is not what's happening back home in Maine for him. And he brings these watercolors back, and of course people are, enormously impressed, and the ethnicity that's put in, it adds that extra element of the exotic. Not only is it warm, but there are people that are not like me. Right, so it feels more like a tourist thing because you're going to interact with a culture you may not have anything in common with. So it gives you that sense of that aura of going somewhere else. And then, of course, Zane Grey, who is pictured here, does a lot in the Upper Keys. He's here around the same time. A little bit later, there's a few visits that Winslow Homer and Zane Grey will overlap, because Winslow Homer comes down several times during the course of about 15 to 20 years, and Zane Grey is writing about the fishing. And so you can start seeing the groundwork being laid for tourism in the Upper Keys, because Zane Grey is there writing books about how great the fishing is, how relaxing it is, how he loves the fighting fish. And it resonates with people who would like to do the same thing. And he's doing in the Upper Keys a lot of what Winslow Homer is doing by painting these tropical landscapes in the Lower Keys. And at the time that Winslow Homer visits, and a little bit later Zane Grey in the Upper Keys, and they're not as developed, Key West is the largest city in Florida. It's crazy to kind of think about that. And I say this, and I think I say this in almost every talk, because it's almost unfathomable, because I drive through Miami and you think, God, like, how was this place bigger than Miami at some point? It was, by a lot. We had 18,000 people living in here, and Miami in the 1880s wasn't even Miami yet. It wasn't incorporated as a city, and there were enough settlers there. There's 150 people there. At the same time, we have 18,000. And never mind the population's huge, but we have people working. They're working in wrecking. They're working in sponging. They're rolling over 1 million cigars a year on this island. So we're abuzz with activity. And as I say, we're getting those businessmen to come down, and we're getting those occasional tourists, but we're still a little bit more inaccessible than most. But there's a need and a want, not on the Key Westers' part, for tourism to become something for them, because they're making money hand over fist in all these other industries. They don't need the tourism money. But hey, if they want to come down and they can, supplement, that's great. But that's not the driving force for us. We're on the mainland. It certainly was a big help, because they needed the influx of cash in order to clear land and develop land. Key West was already well above everyone else. So it wasn't as much of a, and it was harder to get here. So it's sort of a win-win for the locals in some way, because they're unmolested as they're going about their daily business, and they don't need the money. And also they would tourists get in the way, or how development would be different. And so a lot of these photos, any excuse to show old photos in these talks I adore. So this is not too far around the corner. This is Fitzpatrick Street here. So you're looking at Front Street here, right near the seaport. Fitzpatrick, if you need a Sloppy Joe's reference, it's over here. But you can see that there's another hotel, and the Russell Hotel is here. And then you've got the Louvre Hotel here. So who are they catering to? They're catering to these businessmen that are coming here that have mostly maritime and cigar dealings. Well, the Russell House burns down, and they replace it with the Jefferson, which is bigger and better than it was, because there was a demand for it. There started to be a lot more tourists. So this Jefferson Hotel, this is on the 100 block of Duval Street. You can see the bank. That's a good reference point for you to understand where this is sited. If you need the entrance to Hog's Breath, it's right here. But it's a big structure. It's a big hotel, and this is still before the turn of the century. And so there's clearly a demand for it, but it's not for the people that you think. There's a correspondence from newspapers, far afield that have somebody living here full time. The cigar manufacturers that are back and forth to Cuba are staying in places like this. We're still not a tourism market. And then I just really love this photo of, this is the front of the Jefferson Hotel with all of these people. Like, just, must be a Tuesday morning, right? There's no special occasion. They're just dressed to the nines, because that's what you did. But things were going to change with Henry Flagler. Our future in tourism is going to change. Henry, if you've heard anything about Henry Flagler, and not just the overseas railroad portion of it, but the reason Henry even comes to Florida in the first place is because his first wife, Mary, is sick. She has pulmonary issues. And the doctor, like many other doctors to their pulmonary patients, say, hey, go to Florida, go somewhere warm. And that prompts Flagler and his first wife to come to Florida. He has tons of money. It's not up to snuff for his standards, what he's been accustomed to in his career as one of the principal owners of Standard Oil. And he gets an idea in his head, seeing like, how many other people like me or, my wife who's ill are coming to Florida for health reasons but can't find a suitable place to stay or an easy way to get here. And he goes into a full second career developing the east coast of Florida, the first of which is the Ponce de Leon Hotel. And we won't go through his hotel chains, but there's a proof of concept there. And that's why I mention it, because he thinks, okay, let me put money into this and see how it works. He builds the Ponce de Leon in St. Augustine. It is wildly successful. He gets the creme de la creme of business from all the major cities in the United States, plus Europe. They come to Florida and they enjoy themselves, and he works his way down the coast, but he has to find ways to get these folks to his properties. And he does that by building his own railroad. Because when you have enough money and you have a problem, I guess, you find creative ways to solve it. And he starts building this railroad up and down the, up and down the east coast of Florida. And it's mainly to bring supplies to build his chain of hotels. But then the happy benefit is, once the railroad line is there and you've opened hotels in these quaint, what were very tiny, unpopulated places like Ormond Beach, Palm Beach, eventually Miami, you can bring your tourists, you can bring those people from wherever they are on your railroad, and you can get them directly to your hotels because the stops were adjacent to it and nowhere else. He knew precisely what he was doing. And so he brings his guest to Florida, with these railroads, and it's quite an experience. He went all out. It was a luxurious way to travel to Florida, where you had been on a cramped steamship, maybe with your own room if you had enough money, but if not, it's not an easy journey, and it can take days, and it can take longer depending on the weather and time of year and the wind and everything else. And here he offers you a solution. You can leave New York and you can be in Florida in less than 24 hours. You can have your own train car if you're rich. You can actually, if you own your own train car, which a lot of them, the Carnegies and Rockefellers did, hook your own train car up to my locomotive, and we'll take you in your own, in your own train car to Florida, and you can be there in less than 24 hours. This is attractive, right, to people. But what drives Flagler to come all the way down here? Because let's face it, it's insane what he proposes, and eventually to come down here. But, he's a businessman. He is not looking at it as, remember, Key West is the largest city in Florida. We're the most profitable city in Florida. He has a business mind. He wants to make money. And why shouldn't he bring his train all the way down to Key West to have access to the cigars, the sponges, the produce coming out of the West Indies? And what seals the deal for Flagler is the Americans saying they are taking over the construction of the Panama Canal in 1904. They say, we are going to start the Panama Canal construction, or we're going to carry on what had been going on for a long, long time. We'll get it done. And Flagler says, if goods don't have to go all the way around, down under South America, come back up, and they can cut through the Panama Canal, what is the closest deep water American port? Where are ships going to go? And he assumes it's going to be Key West. And his thought is, it's not passengers, it's not bringing tourists here. He wants to be able to bring his freight cars all the way down here, so when ships are coming out of the Panama Canal, he can take the produce, take the goods, take whatever these ships are carrying, and then he can put them on his trains, and then he can transport them. And it's a time save for shipping companies, so who would argue with that? But the benefit is we get tourism out of it. It's not his intention, but it's a result of this big project. And the first place that opens in this system is Long Key Fish Camp, up in Long Key, obviously. But this was established initially, and this is where Zane Grey is going to spend a lot of time writing about his fishing exploits and upping tourism in the Upper Keys. The camp was actually built as worker housing to build the railroad. And once the railroad's complete in the Upper Keys, what are you going to do with these really good buildings? And if you've been, the geography of the Florida Keys, up in the Upper Keys, they're very skinny. So any direction you look, you're almost waterfront property. So why don't we repurpose this and we can make it into a dude's fishing camp? And that's what they did. Like, it was a no women kind of invited kind of place. I mean, they were invited, but no woman wants to say, hey, honey, what are we doing this year for vacation? And you're like, well, I'm going to take you to the stinky fishing hole in Florida where there's no mosquito control, right? Like, this was a good excuse for, guys to come fishing together. And it was enormously successful. And so he was able to repurpose a lot of these buildings. And it's interesting to see some of the feedback, what gets printed in the newspapers. Citizen says, we have tips from good authority that Long Key Fishing Camp is going to be crowded this winter. It is one of the most attractive places along the line, contains a 2-story hotel, which is the picture that's behind it, and about 30 neat little cottages. What a great idea. We'll turn workforce housing into vacation rentals. Great. Things are humming at the Long Key Fishing Camp. Mackerel and kingfish are plentiful. So are the tourists. Right? So we're getting to see recreational tourists come into the Keys, and they say the winter vacation is now the thing. Take a vacation. What's a vacation? That's not a word that's used in the English language very often because, again, it was health tourism and not a vacation. But now this is inserted more and more into the vocabulary. Every physician advises it. So go somewhere warm for the winter. Every man and woman who can afford it takes it. All good to see this change into the recreation. But Flagler's going to get his railroad here. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because that opens up the door to really where we find what we think about as our tourism here. Train arrives January 22nd of 1912, and in the paper, in the Florida Times Union, I love this quote, and this is the last railroad thing I'll talk about, but just know that it really does have a big impact for the tourism market. It doesn't do what Flagler wants in freight, but it says, today marks the dawn of a new era. The old Key West, one of the most unique of the world's historic little cities, is shaking off its lethargy, and from today, the spirit of progress and development will be greater than ever. Boy, if you can look into the future, right? Thinking the railroad was going to change all that. But Key West does change because of the railroad, and businesses start cropping up. And this is kind of fun to see some of these businesses. So after the railway opens, you're going to find a lot of businesses move away from the seaport. This is Island City House. This still exists as a place to stay. It had been a residence of a ship's captain who was from Charleston. He saw tourism. He saw dollar signs because it's near the seaport. It's not near the historic seaport and where the train terminates. So he opens this up and adds another floor to it. Again, I just really like this picture because, again, they're just dressed so nice all the time. And this is how much the railroad meant to tourism. If you walk by the building, so this is the Island City House on the William Street side, not on Eaton Street. And so here is, the carpenters made an homage to Flagler. Do you see how that is the bridges? Oh my God, right? Isn't that cool? I love it. When I do walking tours, I'll stand there for 10 minutes. I'm like, do you see the bridges, right? Like this is understanding how tourism is going to change the Key West market, and knowing that Flagler's Railroad arriving in Key West is going to slightly shift the economic impact to the residents. It's not just going to be about the industries, the fishing and the sponging and the cigar making. We can have tourist dollars too. So I think that was a really clever homage. The Oversea Hotel opens on Fleming Street, which is, again, part of that building is still there. And this is, I love this because, again, you can tell where the marketing is and how it's shifting away from people who are traveling to Key West because they have business here to people who are traveling to Key West because it's the nearest hotel to railroad and steamboat station. Okay? Tourism is changing, and they're attracting different people to Key West. Other hotels, I don't know much about the Panama Hotel. Again, just kind of love this picture, so I threw it in there because it's neat. But there's all these hotels that had never been here before, but they all open within a year or two of the railroad arriving in Key West to cater to the number of tourists coming here. One of the other big ones that opens is the Trevmore. This opens in 1918. Any Hemingway buffs in this audience will know, of course, this is the Ford dealership on the bottom floor, and Hemingway was staying in the building when his Ford didn't show up. But aside from the Hemingway connection, it is a fully functioning hotel that's near the seaport and the railroad station. And after the fire of 1886, their marketing plan was saying that they were a fireproof hotel, because everything else, most of the other ones were made of wood. And in case you were worried about something happening here and we didn't have enough of a fire department to make you feel comfortable, why don't you stay at the Trevmore? It's near all of what you need. If you're on and off the railroad, it's very convenient for you. 46-room hotel, it's pretty substantial. And of course, it's this building today, but we have several of these cropping up within a certain number of years after the railroad arrives. The largest, we get our first real resort. This is how you know this is when tourism is shifting, is we get the Casa Marina, right? We don't have resorts. We have these smaller hotels that cater, but they're hotels. You can eat and you can go to sleep, and I guess you can sit on the front porch in your finery and socialize. But that's it. There's no fun. I mean, there's nothing built in for you to do something. You can sit and read. I find that fun. Some people want to do other activities, and that's what the Casa Marina allows. As Casa Marina is built and grows, this is all part of Flagler's vision. He's deceased before the Casa Marina comes to fruition, but it is Key West's first true resort. It's on the beach. It's near nothing, right, except the beach. It's not near the railroad depot. It's not near the historic district where you may have business, near the cigar rolling factories. It's not. It's there for pleasure. That's new. That's not how we've operated before. So again, it signals this shift in tourism in Key West. And of course, and now they have activities. You can go lounge on the sun deck. You can go play croquet. You can play tennis. There's a little mini golf course on the lawn there. It's for pleasure. You're supposed to come here, and not necessarily because your doctor told you to, and not because you have business, but because you can, and you enjoy vacation. It's really quite fascinating. And I love this image because this just shows you when Casa is finished, there is nothing near it, right? There's nothing nearby to show how isolated in fact that property was. And so you know that no one has business dealings anywhere in that neighborhood because there's nothing there, right? But what there is this putt-putt golf on the lawn. Very cool. But that shift in tourism. Okay, moving forward, because then we're going to get, during the Florida land boom of the 1920s, this is when you get La Concha to sort of compete with Casa, but it's downtown. So it's kind of marrying up those two things. If you're here for business, but you also want a sun deck, let's build this. And they spare no expense in building the La Concha Hotel. And it opens in 1926. So, and the Casa opened in 1921, well, New Year's Eve in 1921. It's really 1922. So this only opens about 4 years later. And they spend a lot of money on this 160-room hotel as it's built. And okay, so this is a great card. Key West only fireproof hotel. Again, the marketing to attract tourists is really quite fascinating. And we were really lucky to know how much it costs, Because people always ask, like, oh, gee, how much was it? And this is going to be closer to like 1928, 1929. So you can get a single room, hot and cold water, no AC, $5 and $6. What a bargain! Right downtown, double room. You can get a parlor suite, and then you're on the European plan, so you can get some of your food included. And of course, what does well for tourism, especially for this hotel, is that Hemingway includes La Concha in To Have and Have Not. He references it, so it becomes a little bit of a boost. But really, a great hotel, and Tennessee Williams is going to stay there. So it's got a long history. But the problem is right after the hotel opens, and Cass has only been open less than a decade, we have the Great Depression. And this is really where you can see the marked change in tourism after the Great Depression, because this place was bankrupt. This place was absolutely bankrupt. There was a thought because the market crashes in 29, but it doesn't really get bad till 33. It doesn't happen in the next day. It takes a few years for that market crash to really take a deep root. And by 1933, Key West is so poor. No one's picking up the trash. No one's paying their taxes, right? Because they have no money to pay their taxes. Most of the cigar factories closed. There's no sponges. There's no nothing. People aren't paying their taxes. Where's your tax money go? Garbage collection. So if they're not collecting your garbage, you can imagine what this town smelled like, right? With piles of refuse on the outside, on the curbs. And there was a thought that it may be better, rather than coming in and trying to figure out how to help Key West get back on its feet, that the money was better spent on picking everyone up and moving them off this island. That's how bad it was. But they were going to move them, the thought was, somewhere in the Tampa, Ocala area, but they're poor up there too. The Depression hit them equally as hard. It was a fleeting thought, but it was in the newspapers, and it was, nuts. But, there's not much to do until Julius Stone walks in. That's him. That's Governor Schultz of Florida at the time. He sends Julius Stone here and says, look, these people are poor. The town stinks. There's no sewer line either. Go down there and see what you can do. What is your best assessment of how to go forward with this island? Should we move everybody or not? And Julius comes down and he says a whole lot of things. But what's mainly, I think, important is he comes up with this idea, which no one had ever really thought about before, which is crazy because we understand what the tourism market is now. But we must make Key West so attractive the world will beat a path to its door. And he does. He wants to make this the Bermuda of North America, or whatever he says, which is stupid. It's counterintuitive because Bermuda is part of North America, but whatever. Julius didn't seem to care, but he wants to take this trashy Key West and transform it into something really interesting. So I'll speed up here. He invites, the federal government pays for artists to come down and paint beautiful scenery that can then be replicated on brochures, postcards, whatever, and distributed around the country, particularly in the winter months, to attract people to Florida. They publish the guidebook. This is a fold-out map to say what all the tourist attractions are, which, hotel without a name. There's a beach, another beach. They're trying to attract people here. And they send out that guidebook. They send out this really attractive guidebook that tells you all about things to do, and gorgeous artwork gets produced locally by these WPA artists that are shared as postcards and in these tourist books. So who wouldn't want to come here in the winter if you're seeing these idyllic scenes published in a book that has been mailed to your house without you asking for it, right? I mean, that one's just fun. I don't know how attractive that is, but it's fun. And then this harks back. This is a WP artist. This feels like the Winslow Homers from 50 years before, right? Using that same, that thought of Winslow Homer was onto something before everybody else was really onto something. Again, just these wonderful things. The Key West Art Center opens. We're going to start seeing, and people are attracted to come here. We get about 35 to 40,000 tourists the first winter between 35 and 36. And that was the first year we marketed Key West. That's an impressive number considering the number before that was almost zero. And people had to up their game. A lot of our tourist stuff, and I'll get into that, but I'm also trying to be a little more sensitive to time now because I'm talking too much. But the problem is the railroad gets wiped out in 35. right? So we have a very short tourist market for that winter, and then this is going to, or, the run up to people making plans and then not. But fear not, even though the railroad's gone, there was already, and I want to make sure people understand this, is before the railroad is destroyed in the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, many parts of the overseas highway was already built and in use. So the railroad getting cut off by that hurricane does not mean we are inaccessible anymore. The road is open in parts. You can see here, you can drive all the way down to Lower Matacumbe, put your car on a ferry, put your car on another ferry, super annoying, and then you can drive the rest of the way down because the overseas highway was done before the hurricane. And here's the ferry you can shove your car on. Just ominous, but a lot of people did it. And then I'm going to show you, okay, this is fun. Or if you had your own car and you didn't want to put it on the ferry, let me see if I can get this to work. There was this marketing ploy by Chevrolet. Enjoy. Oh, why is it so low? I don't know why the sound's not on now. It worked before. Well, there's just some music playing. I'll subtitle it for you. While we have no sound, Chevrolet introduced a new car with great shocks. And so here's Key West. They're encouraging Chevrolet owners just to drive down the Keys. I'm making it, they're really pushing the marketing. I'm not, because that looks horrible, right? The ride. Then they're saying, listen, the road's under construction in some places. You don't have to wait for the road to be done. This is how they're doing the parts that are missing. But, okay, and then there's more dredging. They really went full-on dredging. I'm going to go with it now. Thank you. So here's the railroad, but the railroad's still running, but it's almost, no one's using it. It's going bankrupt, which is cool to see the railroad actually going over the Keys. But so the railroad's only running once a day. So take your Chevrolet with the shocks and just drive right over the railroad tracks. This is what Chevrolet is suggesting that American tourists should do to get to Key West. And then you get off the railroad track and then hop back on the overseas highway that's already built, and you're on your way to beautiful Key West. It's nuts, right? It's absolutely nuts. So they are, once the railroad is done, they do, the state of Florida buys the bridges, the right-of-ways, and they have the intention of connecting that full road, which had been the plan all along, but they were going to build their own bridges adjacent to the the Flagler Railroad system, but now they didn't need to because they was no longer being used, so they retrofitted. These are some cool images, and they never see the light of day, but how do you take a single railroad track and then widen it, not much, by the way, for two cars? They have all these workers putting I-beams across the pre-existing bridges that Flagler built, and then they're pouring concrete on the top of it, and you can see the size of these guys. How do you fit two giant land yachts, in the 40s and 50s, when these cars are getting larger and larger as opposed to the 20s, passing one another on the 7-mile bridge, right? It's dangerous, but hey, you can drive down here. And the overseas highway opens officially the full length in 1938. It opens, and Greyhound initiates a service right away. So we make it really accessible to come to Florida to enjoy what we have, the beaches, but that's not enough for people. We start upping our game for attractions as well. This is when we get the aquarium, and I'll go into that, and Theater of the Sea. But we're trying to make it, because now people are traveling on their own time in their cars. Key West is not just the destination anymore. Nobody's just getting through the Upper Keys on a train trying to get to Key West. When you're in the car, you can pull off to the side of the road anytime you want. And now the Upper Keys think, well, we can have people stop in a hotel here. We can put attractions here. And so the Upper Keys begin initiating and building attractions up there. We get the municipal golf course is paid for during the Great Depression. It's already open, but they come down and fix it up. So this becomes a tourist attraction. and not just for residents, but hey, you can come to Key West and play golf. Even the WPA artists this is a postcard of the golf course, and I don't know what, in the 1930s, what this gal thinks she's wearing on the golf course. But, okay, they're having a great time. But, I mean, look, people coming down, this is Key West Golf Course in the 1930s. The Key West Aquarium is built with federal money and opens as an open-air aquarium. It has no roof on it. This is not going to end well for them, by the way. That's a whole separate talk because of the algae growth from the sun just baking on water that's not moving around. Not only does the aquarium open, but the botanical garden opens. The botanical garden in Stock Island, that's also paid for by federal money. And that is open specifically as a tourist attraction in the Lower Keys to attract tourists here. And I don't want to forget our friends in the Upper Keys because Theater of the Sea opens around the same time as an attraction to get people to stop in Isla Mirada and enjoy themselves, and they can get back in their car, I don't know, tomorrow, spend the night. There's a restaurant down the street. There's a hotel down the street. One of the coolest things, I think, that we had as a sightseeing tour, I know, it's just so cute. This is Ramon Navarro, and he owned his own sightseeing bus. He called it a bus around Key West. This is Naval Station Key West in the background. There's a couple sailors over here. This is actually on the Mole Pier where we do not have access anymore. He's parked on the Mole Pier. He's taking tourists around. Teddy the dog used to ride around on the roof of the car as he would take tourists slowly around the island. So, what a unique, even the locals are getting into it and figuring out their own ways to capitalize off the tourist market. There's Teddy up there again, on top. I think it's wonderful. And as we're progressing, the Hemingway house is no longer occupied. Hemingway and Pauline, once Hemingway dies in the 60s, the house is sold to the same family that owns it now. And they don't want to use it as a house. They want it as an homage to I was going to say Tennessee Williams. Oh, my God. Don't tell him I said that to Ernest Hemingway. As a tourist attraction, the lighthouse is pulled offline in the 1960s because it's no longer a navigational aid. And so they decide to turn it into a military museum, which is a tourist attraction. This is them loading a submarine onto the property of the lighthouse so it can be a military museum for tourists to climb the tower. Contour train comes in around the same time, this late 1960s, again, as an homage to Henry Flagler and what Flagler did, right? It's a train, and it takes people down the Keys, just around town. But, the idea is just to thank Flagler for what he did by the contour train is running a really long time. And the tourists are loving it. The tourists in the 50s, particularly in the 50s and the 60s, love this. And we have outgrown any accommodation that we have. And this is where the big resorts start opening. Pier House opens, by David Walkowski builds and opens the Pier House. Not only does he open this, he owns several areas in Key West, mostly around Green Street and Front Street, that he builds or repurposes buildings for businesses that are catering specific ice cream shops, souvenir shops, restaurants, like little tchotchkes and books and things that people can buy. These people are investing heavily because we don't have cigars anymore. We don't have sponging anymore. Tourist dollars after that Great Depression, really, tourist dollars are our dollars. That's where it became our economy, and still is. And I do want to pay, and I'm almost done, I swear. I want to pay attention to the gay tourism market here because it comes out of necessity, because you'll hear a lot of complainers that have lived here a long time saying like, oh, in the 70s, man, you can shoot a gun down Duval Street and not hit anybody because no one was here. And it's not lack of tourism. It was, but it was the Navy moving out almost overnight. They closed the Navy base, and all these properties were just left vacant. And the people, because Tennessee Williams lived here, because Elizabeth Bishop had that connection here, and because of Tennessee Williams, mostly that there were a lot of Broadway actors, actresses, producers, directors coming to Key West who were gay, who can come down, socialize, and they were sort of off the radar here. And when the town became vacant and property was so cheap, a lot of the gays from New York would buy second homes here, and from Wilton Manors, if they were already living in South Florida, came here, bought up a bunch of properties, but not only do they buy the properties, they're opening businesses to complement. They want to work, they're working. They don't want to be on Broadway anymore. So you get some of your really like big businesses open. They're the anchors when all the other businesses close, and they're the ones who are catering and picking up where that tourism market maybe stopped a little bit. The gay men and women moving into Key West and open businesses like Key West Aloe opens in the 70s. Atlantic Shores is a huge resort on the south side of the island. The Monster, the Copa, bars and restaurants that are operated. The Key West Business Guild opens because they're trying to promote tourism, because people had been hurting when the Navy left, and if the gays had money, then we didn't care who we were marketing to. Just come down here and please spend your money. And so the Business Guild gets started then, and it's Fantasy Fest. I mean, obviously hate it like I do or love it. I don't know. But Fantasy Fest comes out of the gay community moving here, opening businesses, and saying we're not making enough during these months, and this is let's come up with something. And so Tony Falcone, Frank Romano, Bill Conkle, and Joe Liska, who are two of them are owners of the Key West Aloe, Fast Buck Freddy's owners, of course. They say let's make Fantasy Fest. So it's trying to attract more tourists through that. And I'll just show, Joe, it's a good picture of them when they were, I think this was one of the Fantasy Fest when they were the Grand Marshals. But, Fantasy Fest is still going strong, but it was born out of the need for tourists in a really slow time of year. And it's, and it has legs. It has some longevity in this community, whether it's, maybe not like as it was back then. But, this has been around since, they started in 1979. Right, with this Fantasy Fest, and it's really brought this tourism toward to today. And I'm going to, because I think we've kind of cut it off now, I'll say 87, whatever. But tourism, once we start gaining momentum, after there's proof positive that tourists still like this place, with the gay community moving here and opening businesses, a lot of the locals, once they started getting in trouble for smuggling drugs back and forth across the Florida Straits, they started opening businesses too. And that's the tourism market we have now, really from that 1980s forward. It's what you imagine it to be. Lots of restaurants, lots of bars, lots of shops. Everything that we have in 2025, we started having in 1980. So we haven't seen much the businesses have changed. Maybe what they're offering, the products have changed over the years, but Duval Street opens really as a main tourist market from that 1980s time period, less for the residents here and more to attract tourists. So I'm going to cut it off there, because I think you can imagine what the rest of the story would be. But that's it for me on the history of tourism in this town.